unforgettable in every way. And forevermore, that's how you'll stay.
My name is Bruce Barnes. I'm with the New Bedford Preservation Society, sponsor of tonight's tour, and our tour tonight is about the textile industry. All the mills were built and all the population came to New Bedford because of the textile industry. This is the industry that made thread and cloth from raw cotton that was imported mostly from the South. That's the textile industry I'm going to talk about tonight. It obviously was a very, very big deal here in New Bedford. We're going to talk about that history and the tremendous growth of New Bedford as a result of the textile industry. Because when you think about New Bedford, if it wasn't for the textile industry, I always say this when I mention this, if it wasn't for the textile industry, New Bedford would be a town like Bristol, Rhode Island. It'd be a nice town, nice waterfront town, would have a nice history, the whaling would be here, but we would have none of the tenements and three-deckers that are here. We'd have none of the brick mills that are here now. We would have nothing like the population of New Bedford as it is now. And we wouldn't have the ethnic groups that dominated the textile industry during its era, the Portuguese and the French Canadians, and many English as well. But so that's the history we're going to talk about. And it starts here at this particular building. I'm going to talk about the building briefly because it's one of the great architectural treasures in New Bedford. The Joseph Grinnell Mansion, built in the 1830s. At the height of the whaling success in New Bedford at that time. Grinnell was a man of tremendous talent. He actually made his money as a merchant in New York City. He and his brother Moses Hicks Grinnell is another famous New Bedford person. He stayed in New York, but Joseph came back when he had enough money and was a very influential man here in New Bedford all his life. He lived to be 97 years old, born in 1788 and died in 1885. So he was a long-lived person, did a lot in his time. And he's the man who brought the textile industry to New Bedford. It's kind of an interesting story how it happened. He was living here, and a young man knocked on his door in the late 1840s. His name was Thomas Bennett, and he was working at a textile mill in Georgia, actually. He was from Fairhaven originally. He had roots here in the South Coast, in this region, and he knew that Joseph Grinnell was one of the richest and most influential persons in the city, and he was asking him for money. He wanted him to invest in a mill that he wanted to build in Georgia. Grinnell obviously was fascinated by the prospect and by Bennett's knowledge of the industry. And he said, yeah, I think it's a good idea, but there's one caveat. You have to build a mill here in New Bedford. And he said, I'll raise the money for you and we'll build a mill here in the city. And Bennett agreed. They ended up buying the spot where the mill is now. The Wamsutta Mill is where the Wamsutta Lofts is, very famous textile mill. That site was chosen because there was no running water in the city at the time. And there's a pond, a very large pond on that site. Can't see it too much anymore because it's completely surrounded by trees and brush and so forth. It's a very large pond. It's called Rodman's Pond. That's the reason why they selected that site. They needed a lot of water. They knew they were going to be hiring lots of people to work in the mill. They needed water because the mill was going to run on steam, coal-fired steam engine, and so they needed a water site. There was not really a lot of running water river-wise in New Bedford for potability as well as for other reasons, and so that's the site they chose, and they bought it from a man by the name of Benjamin Rodman. So anyway, they built the mill, and Grinnell, being Grinnell, he was very influential. He was a congressman. And he was Abraham Lincoln stayed here at one point in the late 1840s. He was really best friends with John Quincy Adams, who was a longtime congressman and former president of the United States. Spent a lot of time here as well visiting. So he had a lot of influence and connections. And one of the things that he did, which businesses do now on a regular basis, but it probably wasn't that common in his day, was he called in consultants to help him figure out how to build the mill, how to finance the mill, which was very important, how to run the mill, because there wasn't any mill people here at the time, really, except Bennett. And he hired people from Rhode Island, actually. Rhode Island was the seat of the Industrial Revolution in America. And textiles is the origin of the Industrial Revolution worldwide. The English began a factory scale textile industry, which was innovative at the time, because all the manufacturing was kind of cottage industry until that time. You know, small places and villages and stuff would make everything. But the Industrial Revolution made big giant factories which employed people to make things for corporations, basically. And that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England. Samuel Slater brought it here to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and he is really the founder of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. The Slater Mill is a really cool museum if you're interested in textiles. They have a nice collection of machines. They have a working water wheel that runs the machine shop, which is right next door to the mill, so you can get a really good idea of what it was like to work in a that's a very small mill compared to the ones that were built here in New Bedford. But nonetheless, if you have any interest in this topic at all, the Slater Mill is a very cool place to go, and I would encourage you to go there. So this is the mill, the first mill that was built. The Wamsutta Mill was a small granite mill on the site where the Wamsutta Mill is now. Everybody's familiar with does anybody not know where the Wamsutta lofts are, the original Wamsutta? Just raise your hand and I'll tell you what it is. There was a mill, it was like in the courtyard. It was situated where the parking lot is to the big Wamsutta lofts. It was a very small granite mill. They actually quarried the granite from an island right across the river in Fairhaven, right opposite where the mill was built. It was successful from the start. They built a gigantic granite mill perpendicular to where the two mills on Route 18 are now, because the mill was very successful. They just expanded over the years. Wamsutta was a money-making operation from day one. The first run of the mill was a successful sale, and it continued to be successful throughout the era of the textile industry. And the thing about the Wamsutta Mill, which is very important to understand about the growth of textiles in New Bedford, its business model, based on the advice of the consultants that they got from Rhode Island in particular, they said, make fine goods. The textile industry had been thriving in New England for 50 years, really, before New Bedford got involved. New Bedford didn't get involved for any number of reasons, primarily because they didn't have a water source. Most of the early mills were driven by water, and there was no running river nearby to power a mill of that size. But as you know, if you know anything about the history of textiles in New England, the Blackstone River in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, all the way up to Worcester and through Pawtucket and so forth, the Merrimack River and the Nashua Rivers in the northern part of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, very, very important rivers. And any river that had a running water system had a mill on it at some point prior to when Bedford even got involved. So the industry was very mature when New Bedford got involved in the late 1840s, and the consultants all told them, make fine goods, make the highest quality goods you can, because you'll be at the top of the market, because not everybody's making this stuff. A lot of people have old machines, they've been in business a long time. And that business model, for all the mills I'm going to talk about tonight, because the original capitalization of the Wamsutta Mill was $160,000. And by 1920, the capitalization of all the mills in New Bedford was $100 million. In today's money, that's like $8 billion. There's a lot of cities 3 or 4 times New Bedford's size in the country today whose economies do not come close to $8 billion in private financing. So it was an enormous industry. New Bedford was almost a one industry town for all the years. And the demise was catastrophic, but we'll get to that at the end of the tour. Wamsutta Mill was all by itself as the only mill in New Bedford until the city decided to put running water into the city in the 1860s. From 1860 to 1869, they raised the money. Population of the city was about 25,000 at that time. Wasn't as big as costed nearly as big as it is now. It probably really, most of the city probably started like Cottage Street, and there was some houses beyond, some houses beyond Cottage Street, only down to like Allen Street. The waterfront, the front street, Water Street, that extended quite a bit north and south and so forth. But it was a pretty small area. But nonetheless, they piped every house and every business with running water by 1869. And that was the beginning of the textile industry expansion in New Bedford. The second mill that was built in the early 1870s was called the Potomska Mill. It was in the South End. People are familiar with the South End. There's a Potomska Street just across just about where the highway is towards the waterfront, where Potomska Street is, the gas station there now. I think it's what the Russian gas station is there now. That's where the Potomska Mill was, a pretty big mill. So that's the introduction to the business. Wamsutta had numerous mills by 1869 when Potomska was made. The big mills on County Street, on Route 18 that you see now, were built. A bunch of mills in the back. They kept on expanding. Every time they expanded, they didn't add to the existing building. They just built a new building. That's how they expanded. Some of the mills at the end of the textile era, like the Hathaway mill, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, they had 15 buildings on site down there in Coe Street. 15 buildings. So when they expanded, when they needed a new weave shed, when they needed a new spinning facility, when they needed a new building for anything, more capacity, they didn't add on to the old building, just build a new one. This building here is now the Kennedy Donovan, part of the Kennedy Donovan School, which is across the way there. And prior to this, it was the Orthodox Jewish synagogue for many, many years. But it was built as a nice mansion by Cornelius Grinnell, a relative of Joseph Grinnell, and it was purchased in the 1870s by a man named Horatio Hathaway. And Horatio Hathaway was a major investor in the textile industry. Now, I think we're going to show a picture of what the Hathaway house looked like around 1890 when he was living in the house. And when you look at as soon as you see the picture, you'll say, oh yeah, that's this house. Even though it's been terribly altered and so forth, the house hasn't lost its look so much as you might think. You'll be able to see that window was in the old house as well. It doesn't have the Star of David on it, but it has a lot of the details. You'll see as soon as you see the house, you say, oh yeah, I can see what this house is like. Anyway, after the Potomska Mill was built in the early 1870s, there was a recession in the country. A national recession called the Panic of 1873. So there wasn't a lot of development in anything at that time. And the whaling industry, which had a lot of hits over the years, took a couple of major hits in the 1870s. So textiles, when the recession ended in 1880, all this capital that had been accumulated by the whaling industry over the previous decades started to be invested in new mills. And in the 1880s, there was a boom in textile mill development. There were a number of mills in the South End and in the North End. If you've heard of mills like the Acushnet Mill, the City Manufacturing Company, the Bristol Mill in the North End, the Pierce Mill, all these mills, and the Howland Mill in the South End, with Howland Places, all were developed in the 1880s. And it was just the beginning of the flood that would occur in mill development and mill profits, and textiles taking over the city, really, as far as population, as far as commerce, development, because mills were always very, very labor intensive. I'm going to talk about the makeup of the population of people that worked in the mills in a few minutes, but they were very labor intensive. A mill like Wamsutta, in its heyday, say when those two mills right on Route 18 were opened for business by 1865. Those mills probably employed 500 people in each building. So you had number two, which had 4 mills in 1865, probably employed 10 to 15,000 people. It's a lot of folks to work in one place, but it was very labor intensive. You had people managing just a few machines each, and the floors were just packed with machines when they were in full operation. And you see pictures of them, lots of pictures in textbooks and stuff about the inside of mills and so forth, and you can see there's barely room to walk from aisle to aisle. There's so many machines in there, and people had to manage those machines during the day. So by 1892 or 1893, when there was another recession, New Bedford had about 12 corporations that had mill sites. They extended from the Hathaway and the Dartmouth Mill, which was the mill that's right next to the dike, actually, in the south end, all the way up to the Pierce Mill, which is where the Riverside Park is now. People might remember the Pierce Mill. It burned down, I think, in the 90s. Big fire in the 90s that burned lots of the Pierce Mill. It was a huge complex. That was the extent of all the mills were going. There were about 10 to 12,000 employees altogether in the city at that time. They had a big strike. When the recession came, there was a big strike because the mills cut back. When the mills wanted to reduce expenses, now what they always do is they cut wages, or they don't give wages, whatever. But in the day back then, they reduced hours. So they reduced the amount of money you can make by just telling you can only work 3 days this week. We're going to lock the mill on 2 days, and you can only work 3 days. That's how they did it in those times. So there was a strike during that period because they weren't making that money to begin with, and to lose a couple of days' pay was always very painful. But anyway, the mills continued to make money. The number was like a 6% on your investment. The buy-in probably for an investor was either $10,000 to $20,000 a share, which is a good amount of money. When you look at the stockholders and the board members of the mills, because they're all published and easy to find, you have to realize that all those people probably got a $20,000 to maybe even $40,000 buy-in. When Henry Huddleston Rogers, famous New Bedford Fairhaven financier, passed away in 1909, he had $50,000 in the Butler Mill, which is a South End mill. So people, there was a lot of money. Considering that most people probably only making $300 or $400 a year, there was tremendous wealth that had been generated by the whaling industry that was transferred into textiles from the 1860s and continued that way. Horatio Hathaway, who lived in this house until he died in 1899, he was not a whaling merchant, but he was a trade import-export guy, lived in New Bedford, made his money here, and he was a very big player in mills prior to the one that was named after him in 1889. He was on the boards of lots of mills. If you read about the history of the mills and who was running them, his name appears a lot. He bought this building, I think, around 1875 or so, died 1899. But the Hathaway Mill is the big mill. Everyone's probably familiar with Berkshire Hathaway. For those that don't know, the Hathaway Mill was the last mill to close in New Bedford in 1985. That's a textile mill. Warren Buffett, the famous financier from Omaha, Nebraska, he had purchased the mill when it was called the Berkshire Hathaway Mill, and then he named his holding company Berkshire Hathaway. So Berkshire Hathaway is the Hathaway part of Berkshire Hathaway is our Hathaway Mill in the South End. Anyway, just a little side story there. Any questions about anything about any of this so far? City's growing like crazy. Population of the city in 1890 was 40,000, of which about almost a third worked in the textile mills at that time. Tremendous investment, and it was only starting to grow. Up until this point, by 1893, when the next recession came, all the money and all the mills were owned and operated by New Bedford people. They had cut their teeth for the most part at Wamsutta, and then they branched out and just continued to expand. They started to bring people to work in the mills from all over, but all the investors were from New Bedford. That was going to change at the end of the 19th century, and into the 20th century, we'd had people from all over coming in. But I'll talk about that in a little while. A lot of mills only made thread, spinning mills, but a lot of the mills also had weaving facilities as well. In the 1890s, one of the big major machine makers, because there was a whole industry of machine makers that went on. Lots of Pawtucket, Providence, Worcester, Lowell, that area. They made the machines that did the work, the spinning machines and the looms. And one of those companies, called the Draper Company, in Hopedale, Mass. They made an automatic loom in the 1890s. It revolutionized the industry because all of a sudden you could make cloth faster, better, and with less people. And so everybody started making weave sheds. The weave shed is a building that'll have the sawtooth roof on the top. If you see that sawtooth roof, that's a weaving facility. Now, the reason there are always these long, flat buildings with the sawtooth roof is the automatic loom vibrated so much that if they put it on 2 floors, it probably would have shaken the building apart. So they all made them on 1 floor. The shafting was from below, whereas normally in a textile mill, all the shafting was from above. When you see all those belts that are connected to the machines, with weave sheds, they put all the shafting in a basement that came from below. So they changed things a little bit. But when you see that sawtooth roof, that means it's a weave shed. It's a weaving facility. Sometimes they're on the roof sometimes. In the older mills, like if you remember the old Fairhaven mill, they had a sawtooth roof on the mill and the top, because originally, before the automatic loom, they could put regular power looms, and they usually put them on the top so they'd get more sunlight for the weavers on the top floor. When the mills was first opened until 1890, the companies themselves provided all the housing. It wasn't great looking. It wasn't great housing. There's still some worker housing left over. Some of the more obvious ones there's one in the south end, probably was connected with the Potomska Mill. It's a big giant box. You can always tell what they look like. Big box, flat roof, and the entrances on each side, almost at the corner of the building. Basically, there were 8 or more families in those houses. The bathrooms were in the basement. It was not there were never ideal living conditions in those buildings. Some of the worker housing in the other mills was a little more interesting and livable. The houses that, if you're familiar with the Acushnet Antiques building down by the old Revere building and so forth, that was a big giant textile mill, the Grinnell mill. And they built houses as well. Some of them are still standing in the Hicks Logan area there. That's just to the northwest of the mill. You can still see a couple of the mill housing there. Not all of them have been torn down. So they're scattered around. The Wamsutta mills, most of the Wamsutta mill housing was torn out when they built the highway. But Austin Court, which is just a block west of Purchase Street down there, has a fabulous collection of smaller versions of the multifamily with the entrances on the side, the kind of interesting buildings. That was another version of the mill housing for Wamsutta. Anyway, they all had to have it because there was just no way that they could house all those people. But after 1890, the corporate housing ceased in New Bedford, and 3-decker and the multifamilies started to go up like crazy. It was the way that they housed all the immigrants that were coming to New Bedford. There was sort of a lull in the 1890s as far as development was concerned. The very first mill that was financed by outside money was the Whitman Mill. That's Whalers Cove now. If you're familiar with Whalers Cove in the North End, it's assisted living or some sort of elderly housing. That was the first mill that was built with outside money. And after that, most of the mills that were built were funded by the big machine makers, the big textile machine makers, mills being built north and south, huge complexes, each mill employing thousands of workers. Again, I don't even when you look at some of the mill complexes were huge, and when they were built, those ones in the North End, like where Joseph Abood factory is now, if you're familiar with that area, when those mills were built, there's postcards and photographs of the mills being built, and there's nothing around them. There's no housing yet. And I don't know, and those mills employed thousands of people right out of the box because the Joseph Abood factory was a weave shed, a gigantic weave shed, the biggest weave shed ever built in New Bedford, probably ever built in New England. You can tell it has a sawtooth roof. It had over 6,000 looms in that building. 6,000 looms in that one building. Can you imagine the noise? When I went to the American Textile History Museum in Lowell, which sadly has closed, I went up there to check it out when I was doing research on the mills and so forth, and they had one automatic loom working. It was this fabulous machine. It was so much fun to watch, actually. But even one machine made a racket, clittering, clattering the whole time, and it never stopped, And 6,000 of them, One of the big problems in even textile mills today is what they call fly. And that's all the dust and stuff that comes off the various processes of thread production and cloth production, combing, which New Bedford was combing thread was very, very important in New Bedford. It wasn't developed here, but combing was a process of refining cloth, refining thread and yarn, flicking off all the little small fibers that were stuck to the thread and so forth. Combing was so important, in fact, in New Bedford that if you've been to Penny Brewer's Brewer Banner building down here on Forest Street, just a couple blocks down, that was a comb works. It was a building just built to fix the combing machines because it was so important to the fine goods industry for spinning purposes. What nationalities worked in the mills? Now, prior to the Civil War in New Bedford, the Wamsutta Mill was a running mill. They had recruited people from other mills to work in the mill, but primarily the operative class at the Wamsutta Mill in the early years was Irish. I didn't realize that was the case. I had to look it up to be sure because I didn't know if they had, if they recruited people from other places. There was a considerable Irish population in New Bedford at the time, and most of the mill workers at the Wamsutta Mill in the early years were Irish. During the Civil War, mill production basically stopped because there was no cotton. All the cotton was coming from the southern states. And Wamsutta had just finished a mill. It was completely outfitted with machines. It's one of the mills. It's right on number 4. It's the one right on the north side of the Wamsutta loft site. That mill was completed in 1861, and then the war started. And they didn't ever start operating that machine until the war was over because they couldn't get cotton from any place. Anyway, after the Civil War, a lot of the men who had worked in the mills served in the war. So they needed a whole new population of people to come work in the mills. And in the other mills in New England, they had been recruiting French Canadians for years and years. And Wamsutta actually even had recruiting posters posted in the cities and towns in southern Quebec and New Brunswick to recruit French Canadians to work in the mills. My own, and they had been doing it for many years, even before New Bedford got involved. My own grandparents on my mother's side had worked in the mills until their families had worked in the mills. In fact, even though they were French Canadian and they spoke French, even when I knew them They talked to each other in French in the 50s when I knew them. They were actually born in the United States. They were born in, one of them was born in Maine and one of them was born in New Hampshire. So they had been here a long time. That was in the 1880s. They were already here and they were born here. So they had a long tradition of working in mills. And they were the next huge migration of people that moved to New Bedford. Even the mills in the South End, when I did the research on the Howland mills in the South End, most of the mill operatives were French Canadian. There was a French Canadian church in the South End. Anybody remember St. Hyacinth's? That big, beautiful brick building on the corner of Rivet Street and County Street. You know, where does that building come from? That's the rectory for St. Hyacinth's Church. It's such a nice building, actually. The church is long gone, but the rectory is still there. But then when the new mill starting in 1900, there was a huge expansion in the mills. Probably 15 new corporations were started, some gigantic projects. The Nashawina Mill with the Joseph Boot factory in the North End. The Sharp Mill where the Stop and Shop is down on Dartmouth Street was a huge complex called the Sharp Mill, S-H-A-R-P. Big giant complexes. And they needed huge amounts of help. And most of those people that were recruited to work in those mills were Portuguese, Azorians, and Madeirans. I think that there was some volcanic catastrophe. I'm not sure the history, why they were recruited heavily, but that's when the huge numbers of Portuguese came to New Bedford to work in the mills. Now, New Bedford always had a strong and close association with the Azores, even in the 1700s because of the whaling industry. There was always the Portuguese population here. But after 1900, that was the primary source of labor for the new mills that were going into the city. Now, the population of New Bedford in 1890 was 40,000. In 1920, the population was 120,000. Three times. In 1920, 35,000 people worked in the textile mills. 35,000 people. Now, when you figure that families and so forth, you know, each family, I mean, there was husbands and wives both worked in the mills, there's no doubt about that, but they had children and so forth. When you think about how many people of the 120,000 had a direct livelihood was working in the textile mills, is kind of astonishing, actually. Now, there's a lot of bad to say about the textile mills. The worst thing is child labor. There was a book about child labor in the United States. Child labor was a bad deal across the country. They worked in mines. They worked in all kinds of factories. It was dangerous. But in this particular author, in the chapter on the textile industry, was called the Herod of Industries. King Herod, who killed all the babies in the Bible, the Herod of Industries. That shows you how dangerous it was perceived and was for children. They had always worked in the mills. Moreover, there's lots of books that I was a librarian. I was familiar with books of kids who had written books about their experience as children in the mills, and moreover, a couple of them shockingly awful, really, the abuse they took. It was a dangerous job. The mills had a lot of jobs that were good for people that were repetitious jobs, changing spindles and doing lots of little things that you know were easy to train. You know, a young person could do it, and they did it, and it was kind of a stain on the industry, no question about it. But women were also a huge part of the workforce in textiles from day one. Some of the early mills in Lowell, for instance, are famous for their recruitment of young girls from farms to work in the mills. But even in the heyday of New Bedford mills, probably as many as 40% of the population of workers at the New Bedford mills was female, which is and that was across the industry. Women were a big part of the labor force in textile mills, and New Bedford was probably on that high end as far as percentage is concerned. So there were lots of two-income families. The wage scale was in the 1890s was from $5 a week to $15 a week. Weavers made the most money at that time because they were highest skilled of all the workers. But I did want to talk about the two textile schools that were established, three of them actually, but two of them locally. The state legislature decided to support the textile industry by allowing charters for three textile schools, one in New Bedford, one in Fall River, and one in Lowell. And they were established around 1900. The New Bedford school was the first, and Fall River, New Bedford school started I think 1900. Fall River was 1904. And part of that education, because it was primarily for the managers, for the chemists, for all those people who were going to be doing the more technical parts and designing and so forth, the more technical parts of the textile industry. But they had a night school. And my grandfather, his name was Anthony Mungeon, M-O-N-G-E-O-N, he went to night school and he got a certificate in picking and carding. That was the very first department in the factory, was to open the bales, separate, clean out all the dirt, make sure all the fibers were going in the right direction and so forth. That's the basic what picking and carding was. And he got a certificate in 1908 from Durfee Tech for picking and carding. So they had a night school. He had the energy. He had the energy to do it. The work week for the textile industry for most of its life was 56 hours a week. 10 hours and 10 minutes Monday through Friday, and 5 hours and 10 minutes on Saturday. Yep, 56 hours a week. The house across the street, right here, is a textile mill man. His name was Henry Tiffany. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how the mills were operated on a global scale, really, in New Bedford. New Bedford had something called the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. I like to make an analogy of like the Pro Football League. That's how the textile mills were sort of operated. There was the commissioner of the league or of the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. His name was Andrew Pierce, the senior and junior after the senior died, and they were the head of the league. And the teams were like the individual mills, and there were certain rules that the mills had to follow. If they said, we're going to cut back on hours, everybody cut back on hours. If we were going to do something else, there had to be a certain amount of conformity by all the mills so that everybody was on a level playing field. You didn't deviate from the rules because that would make one mill maybe have an advantage over another and so forth. So there was a very strong collusion between the millmen. And Tiffany was one of them. If you know the Kilburn Mill, which is in the South End, there's a lot of restaurants and so forth in the Kilburn Mill now. That was his mill. He moved into this house about 1900, had it remodeled by Edgar Hammond rather, around 1900. And that's how the mills were run. Now, I have a story about the same thing. This was how it was in all the big mill towns like Fall River as well. Fall River was the same way. Now, Jonathan Bourne was a very famous New Bedford whaler. And he was invested in all the early mills as well. You see Jonathan Bourne's name as a big mill owner in New Bedford. And in the 1880s, he decided to build his own mill, but he did it in Fall River for some reason. I don't know why. He built the Bourne Mill. My grandparents actually worked at that mill. And he decided, because he was a whale, he had owned lots of whale ships. He was a very famous guy. He's the guy who owned the Lagoda, that's the ship that's in the whaling museum. Very important guy in the whaling industry. He decided in Fall River that he was going to set up a lay system, just like they did on whale ships. That each man or each employee was going to have a share of the profits. Now, this set Fall River people a fire, because this was not good, because there's possibility in this lay system or share system, because basically the workers were part owners to some degree in the profits. Now their share of the profits wasn't the same as the shareholders, but nonetheless, there was a possibility during good years that the workers at the Bourne Mill would make a lot of money, more so than their counterparts. Bourne had hired all kinds of Fall River people to run the mill, but nonetheless, he did it for a year or so until he got sick and died, and then they quickly moved back. But he was very much of a maverick, and thank God for him, I guess, or thank God for the mill owners in Fall River, because he would have revolutionized the industry. But so the New Bedford manufacturers were like that. They wanted the control of the industry. They owned not only the mills, but the banks. All the same people that own the mills own the banks. So they had control of all the money. So this $100 million that was invested in the mills was really in the hands of a few people. All that's illegal now. It's called interlocking directorates, where they have pie charts where it showed how so-and-so was on this bank and this board and this mill and so forth. And it was basically to control the mills, to keep them from going under, really. I mean, there was some good things about it, about control, but there was lots of bad things too, because it didn't allow for, I think, manageable growth and fairness across the board. So it was kind of interesting. Those things are all outlawed now, obviously, for good reason, but that's the way it was here. Now, what happened? In the 1920s, the mills started to not fail, but the money started to dry up. The World War I years were big profit makers for the mills. The wages in the mills doubled from 1910 to 1920. So everybody was doing well by 1920. But the mills in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s was great for speculation and so forth. A lot of people were making money. Some of it was phony, some of it was real. But the mills were flat. They were making too much product, and the mills in the South had finally caught up to the mills in New England as far as quantity and quality, and their labor costs were 30% less than New England. Something had to give. And in 1928, that give was a 10% reduction in wages by the mill owners to the operatives. It resulted in a 6-month strike. It was terribly devastating to the city, because not only were all those people out of work, but landlords weren't getting their rents. Little markets and retail in general was, nobody was spending money. It was almost like the Great Depression in New Bedford for 6 months, because there was no economy. Everything stopped. When you have 35,000 people out of work, basically, everything stops. There's no money to spend. But it was the sign, it was an omen that the end was near. They probably didn't realize how bad it was going to be. But when the Great Depression came in October of 1929 with the stock market crash, it was the end of the textile industry in New Bedford. If it wasn't for the Great Depression, mills would have petered out. They would have gone out of business. It wouldn't have been as traumatic as it was, because all of a sudden, within a couple of years of the start of the Great Depression, you had 25,000 jobs that disappeared. It was never going to come back. 25,000 jobs, and tens of millions of dollars in investment and capitalization was lost. The Sharp Mill, which was a big giant complex in the South End, when they auctioned up all their stuff, they had a liquidation sale, hoping to make back some of the money that they had lost when they closed, and they got pennies on the dollar, because none of the machines, the buildings, the only thing that made them any money is when they tore the buildings down, the I-beams, which were used to construct the building, is one of the last buildings and one of the strongest buildings ever built. The I-beams were the only thing that made any money on the auction of the buildings when they tore them down. There was absolutely no value to anything left. All that $100 million, not all the $100 million, but a great deal of that money was gone forever. And the city really had never recovered from that loss. We had all these empty mills. The garment industry took over the space in a lot of the mills and used it for the dress shops and so forth, but it was never the same. The volume and the economy that the textile industry brought to New Bedford was really phenomenal. The city was a really, really important place during those years, the teens and 20s, because there was so much money in town. It's hard to imagine now, really, the economy in New Bedford during those years, but all that disappeared. It was a tragic situation. The same thing happened in Fall River. In fact, the issue in Fall River was so bad, they lost so much money that the city had to declare bankruptcy. One of the only cities in the country of its size to declare bankruptcy in 1937. All the textile mills went out, and they had no tax revenue. Basically, all the textile mills were huge tax providers for services. It was a bad time, and South Coast cities, the big South Coast cities, really have never recovered from that. The mills are still standing here. We still have quite a few of the mills. About 150 mill buildings were built during the textile era. Probably half of those have been torn down at this point, but there's still quite a few left. They're finally being used for housing, and they're finally getting used for important purposes. But and the tenements are still here. They're still the primary. There are like 3,000 tenements at one time in New Bedford, 3-deckers. There's still a couple thousand left. Still a primary residential unit for the city. So the legacy of the industry is still here, but the wealth of the old times is long gone. During the heyday of the textiles in the teens, when there was so much economy, so much product being produced, that they had a problem with storage. A lot of storage was outside. So one of the big mill men, William Whitman, built the biggest building ever built in New Bedford. It's the Belleville Warehouse. It's on Nash Road, right by the train tracks. It's 100 feet wide, 7 stories, and 980 feet long. It's an enormous building. When you look at a map, it looks like this giant anaconda snake. It's so giant. It's so huge. The Belleville Warehouse on Nash Road, just right next to the train tracks in the north end. The biggest building ever built. It was built to store 100,000 bales of cotton. When you see pictures, if you've seen pictures, I'm sure, of the waterfront in the whaling days with all the oil casks and so forth. Well, there's pictures of the State Pier, in the teens and 20s, and it's piled with cotton bales. The standard bale was 500 pounds. It was packed real tight. It was about this big by this big. 500 pounds. That was the standard bale. And a lot of it came by boat, and a lot of it came by rail. Thank you for coming.
Unforgettable in every way, and forevermore, that's how you